how to graph secant. So the original graph of secant, what we need to do is for any time we graph secant actually, we need to think about what the graph of its reciprocal looks like. So the reciprocal of secant x is cosine x. So what we want to do is we want to sit here and graph, I'm not happy with that line, I'm sorry. We want to sit here and graph cosine first. So we set up our x and our y-axis, and we graph cosine. So remember that since there's not a number in front of x, that means the period of cosine here is 2 pi. There's nothing in front of cosine there, so our amplitude is 1. So that tells us how to label our x and our y-axis, because we need to be able to go out to 2 pi, out to negative 2 pi, and our amplitude is going to be positive 1. We're going to go up to positive 1, down to negative 1, because our amplitude is 1. So the way we graph cosine is we make a mark halfway between 0 and 2 pi, and then we make a mark halfway and halfway so that we've got fourths here. And we start with cosine at the top amplitude when cosine is positive, and by this tick mark, that's pi over 2, we need to be at 0. And then at pi, we need to be down here at negative 1. At 3 pi over 2, we're back at 0. And at 2 pi, we're up at our top amplitude again. But we're not actually going to end our graph as cosine, like we're just using this kind of as a tool. So either graph this lightly or make it kind of like a dashed line. Okay, it's going to help us graph secant, but it's really not the part of the graph that is most important. And then we do the same thing on the other side. So you make a mark halfway for negative pi, halfway and halfway, so we've got fourths. Then at negative pi over 2, we're at 0. At negative pi, we're at negative 1. Negative 3 pi over 2, we're here in the middle. Negative 2 pi, we're up at the top. And we can do the rest of our curve nice and dashed. Okay, that's our first step. Step number 1, graph cosine, the related cosine function. Step number 2, draw your asymptotes. Okay, and your asymptotes can change depending on what they gave us, but all we have to do is look for these places. Let me pick a different color. These places right here where our graph crosses the x-axis. Each of these places where we're crossing the x-axis or crossing the middle of our graph, there's going to be a vertical asymptote, because that is where cosine is 0. And since secant is the reciprocal of cosine, that's where we have undefined values. Okay, now notice that, for example, this is going to be from 0 to 2 pi. This is going to be one period of our secant graph, but we have 2 asymptotes in there in 2 periods. And that's going to be important that our asymptotes for secant and cosecant happen twice as often as a period, where tangent, they always happen 1 period apart. So to finish this off, our graph, we go to the max values. Pick a different color. We go to our max values and we draw U-shaped graphs going up. That got a little away from me. We go to the bottom values and draw U-shaped graphs going down. And the reason I'm only drawing a half U on the left and the right is just because our graph stopped at negative 2 pi and 2 pi. So we could keep drawing this that direction, but we kind of stopped our scale there. So either way is fine, whichever way you want to do that. So then this is our secant graph, is the red part with the asymptotes. We use the cosine curve to help us get that. Let's talk about what our vertical asymptotes are. Oh, step number 3, by the way, was drawing the U's. Now our vertical asymptotes. We have to pick an asymptote. So I'm going to pick this one. Where is that asymptote at? It's halfway between 0 and pi. So it's at pi over 2. So x equals pi over 2 plus how far apart are our asymptotes? So this is what I was saying. How far apart are these? And remember that this is happening twice a period. So if our period is 2 pi and we have 2 asymptotes for every 2 pi, that means that our asymptotes are pi apart. So we can put pi k, where k is some number, some integer, okay? But the thing is we have to remember, for tangent, we're going to use the period as it is. But for secant and cosecant, our asymptotes are happening twice as often as the period, so we have to divide by 2. So that's regular secant. Let's check out something a little bit different. All right, let's do 2 secant x over 2. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to start off by graphing 2 cosine x over 2. The only thing we changed here was we changed secant to cosine. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the amplitude of this cosine graph would be 2. The period of the cosine graph would be 2 pi over 1/2, which is, we'd flip the 1/2 up, and that's going to make the period of our graph 4 pi. So we draw our x and our y-axis, and when we label it, out here we're going to have 4 pi and negative 4 pi, because that's how far it takes to get our cosine curve. We're going to have on our y-axis a 2 and a negative 2, because that's our amplitude for our cosine curve. So we make a mark halfway, 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 halfway. Halfway in between is going to be 2 pi and negative 2 pi. We're going to draw our cosine curve. This is a positive cosine curve, so it starts at the top, then it goes to the middle, then the bottom, middle, top, the other direction, middle, bottom, middle, top. So we draw our dashed or light or both cosine curve. That's step 1, drawing cosine. Step 2, draw your asymptotes every place that it goes through the x-axis. So each of these places I just stuck a blue dot on. Where we're crossing the x-axis is where we have asymptotes. And step number 3, at the top of our graph, we draw a U-shape going up. The bottoms of our graph, we draw a U-shape going down. And our vertical asymptotes, well, we need to pick one. One of them, like maybe this one, halfway between 0 and 2 pi is pi. Plus, they're happening twice every period, and our period is 4 pi. So they're happening every 2 pi, k, where k is an integer. And that's secant.